Good morning, class. Welcome to our Week 10 lecture. Today we are going to cover some Christian developments taking place during the Middle Ages, so roughly between 800 to 1400. So it's a big time span, and we're going to cover three kind of parallel movements taking place during this time. So the first kind of movement that we're going to look at is kind of ecclesiastical or political movements. We'll look at some theological movements and then some monastic movements and developments. So, getting started, in the same way that things changed with when Constantine came on the scene, uh, things changed with Charlemagne as well. That is, when Constantine came on the scene, the church was affected. We had conversion of holidays, it elevated to a preferential status, those kinds of things. And so, similarly, when Charlemagne comes on the scene, there's a great effect on the church. And what you'll notice in the Middle Ages is that there seems to be this theme of a desire to increase the power of the papacy. So, with this, you have competing agencies such as ecclesiastical councils, for example, and you'll see uh, that where there are theological developments, it's usually in response to something the Pope has done. So, again, there's competing agencies, and one of those that we'll look at is ecclesiastical councils. And we'll see that in terms of the theological movements and developments, it's usually in reaction or response to something that the papacy has done. And so these councils get kicked back by authoritative leaders when the Pope tries to exert political matters. You see monasteries starting to reform themselves, really in an attempt to reform the church. And so, again, when Charlemagne comes on the scene, there's all kinds of different things happening and taking place. And remember, none of these things happen in isolation. They don't happen in isolation. They are all impacting and influencing one another. Um, and so Charlemagne was crowned on Christmas Day, 800 AD, and he ruled all of what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire, except the British Isles and a part of Spain. He ruled all of that except for part of the British Isles and a part of Spain. Or, excuse me, all of the British Isles and a part of Spain. He felt that he should rule in both civil and ecclesiastical matters. So between 800 and the end of the 15th century, the primary opponent of Christianity was Islam. And so, along with the rise of Islam, you get the fall of the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire was overrun by Muslims permanently in 1453. So, in the East, what you see taking place in the eastern part of the empire is that some become Christians, um, and invasions in the West, are forced uh, conversions, and you see that mainly in North Africa, forced conversions by the Muslims. And so the Holy Land and Byzantium did not have to convert, just submit. So the forced conversions that we hear about or have heard about was taking primarily in the Western North Africa part of the world. But areas like the Holy Land and Byzantium, they were not necessarily forced conversions, but they did have to submit. And so it wasn't really a religious war, though. It was more of Europe versus Islamic invaders. And so it wasn't necessarily exclusively, kind of a religious war, but it was more of here's Europe and here's Islamic invaders. And so the Western Christians, in some sense, it was in some sense more of a threat to Eastern Christians than Muslims were, and we'll talk about that. So, with the East being overrun, the West had no one to call on. So, what you see happening is that Rome and Gaul, modern day France, essentially became friends. So, when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, uh, the emperor of Europe, uh, then the center of Europe then becomes Gaul. So what you see taking place is in the eastern part of the empire and the western part of the empire, the eastern part essentially is overrun and becomes of no help to the western part of the empire. So no one can really is sending reinforcements or aid to the west, and the west is really anything west of Greece. And so what happens is when the Pope crowns Charlemagne, it shifts the center of Europe to Gaul, to France. And so, in this alliance between the Pope and the Emperor here, it did three things. It quickened the separation between the eastern and western branches of the church because it gave the West a military ally. It also created a papal state, and it gave Western kingship a religious sanction, which is important. And so, this alliance between, again, the Pope and the Emperor, it did three things. It quickened the separation between the eastern and western branches of the church because it gave the West a military ally. It was just another reason for the West not to have to rely on the East. It created papal states, and it gave Western kingship a religious sanction. Um, Now, when Charlemagne was crowned, he did not know that he was going to be crowned that day. And so the story goes that as he finished praying and was standing up, the Pope, it was Leo III, then placed the crown on his head. And at the time, the Romans who were present called him Augustus and Emperor, and the Pope and the Pope adored of the Roman Emperor, I'm sorry, adored of the Roman Empire in mind, um, the Pope adored Charlemagne, quote unquote, after the manner of emperors of old. And so the people of Rome still had the glories of the Roman Empire in mind. Because remember, there had been a lot of invaders. One of the reasons the empire shifted, the capital shifted to the east, is because it was more quote unquote Roman. And so people still had the glories of the good old days of what Rome used to be still in mind. And so as the Pope crowned him, as Charlemagne was standing up from praying, um, uh, and adored him, quote unquote, after the manner of the emperors of old, people still had this kind of mindset of what an emperor could be and could do. And they began to call him Augustus, an emperor. And so, and due to these invasions, they lost a lot of what it meant to be Roman. And so, having Charlemagne as a ruler was a big deal to them. And we're going to shift for a moment and talk about the Great East-West Schism. And so, this is when the church between the western and eastern parts of the uh, uh, empire, between the church, the eastern branch and the western branch. This is when that schism, that separation, really fully takes place, and something that we have yet to see any kind of unification over. And so it's the East-West Schism because the churches kind of went with their respective capitals. So the Eastern Orthodox kind of went with saw the father of Constantinople as their leader, so they went with him. And then the western part saw the Pope of Rome as their leader and went with him. And so, and then out of this eastern western development, we then have Protestants that come out of the western part. And so this is where, before 1054, the church really functioned as a whole. There were some schisms, there were disagreements and stuff like that, but there was never really you me kind of mindset. And this really begins to develop here in 1054. So essentially what happens is that the eastern and western branches of the church excommunicate one another. So what happens is that in the middle of a church service, Cardinal Humbert laid down a papal bull excommunicating Father Cyrilius, who was the bishop of Constantinople, and any of his followers. And so Father Cerullius, he responded by excommunicating them. And this happened for several reasons. One is, yes, there were cultural differences, there was different languages, but also there was disputes about whether or not to use unleavened bread during communion. Fasting rules were different, and the West really pushed for clerical celibacy. And so, there's lots of different factors going on, lots of different things going on. And so, also, the father of Constantinople wanted to use the title ecumenical patriarch, meaning that he wanted primacy among all other churches. And then also, there's this thing called the Filioque controversy. So, this controversy is when the West allowed the phrase and the Son to be inserted into the creed established at the Second Ecumenical Council. So, in regards to the creed, it changed from we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. With the Father and the Son, he is worshiped and glorified. That's how the Second Ecumenical Council creed read. And then it was changed to we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. With the Father and the Son, he is worshiped and glorified. And this insertion actually happened in the 6th century, and the West supported it. And the East had a problem with that because the West was unilaterally changing a creed that the entire church had agreed upon. The church on the Second Ecumenical Council, this is the creed. They took it upon themselves to try and change that. And so, um, so lots of things going on, lots of changes, lots of different things influencing and impacting one another. But really, that's kind of what we see in terms of the Great East-West Schism and some of those things that kind of led to that most unfortunate separation. And so that kind of wraps up some ecclesiastical and political movements that we see taking place. Theological movements that we see are in regards to papal reforms. And so these were begun by Bruno, who took the name of Leo the Ninth, and two of his followers, Hildebrand and Humbert, who I just mentioned. Bruno would only be pope if people elected him to be so. So not just appointed by the emperor, but he wanted the people of Rome to put him there. He wanted the people of Rome to put him in power as the pope. And so programs of reform included clerical celibacy, so that there will not be any undivided attention with the kingdom of God, and abolition of simony, so paying for church offices. And so you could pay to work, get a church position if you wanted to. So the relation and purpose of these two is that the church was really the only place left for social mobility. Ending simony meant that the rich and powerful weren't the only ones elected, and ending clerical marriage meant that these positions couldn't be handed down to children. So Bruno, as Pope, was the one who sent Humbert to Constantinople that solidified the East-West Schism. And these reforms were supported by the masses because it was a chance to wrest power from the rich. But attacking both simony and marriage at the same time was unwise because most of the reformers were in the lower class and were unwilling to set aside their wives. And so in general, people supported all these things at large, but there was those who were still married and did not want to set aside their wives. It wasn't until the Second Lateran Council in 1059 that determined how new popes would be chosen, and that is via the College of Cardinals. And so now we're going to talk briefly about the Crusades. The Crusades happened primarily during the 11th to 13th centuries. And we're going to talk two different things. We're going to talk broadly, first of all, about them, but we're going to talk briefly about what they hoped for and what they actually accomplished. And so, what they hoped for was to defeat the Muslims, save the Byzantine Empire, reunite east and west branches of the church, and reconquer the Holy Land, and doing all of this to win heaven, because they were promised if they were promised that if you would go and fight, then you would have a spot in heaven. And so, again, what was hoped for in the purpose of the Crusades was to defeat the Muslims, save the Byzantine Empire, reunite the east and the western branches of the church, reconquer the Holy Land, and doing this all to win heaven. But what was actually accomplished was far less grand. So the Muslims were first defeated due to infighting. Secondly, the branches were united by force during the Fourth Crusade, but split again in 1261 when Byzantine retook Constantinople. And then the Holy Land in the hands of the Crusaders was in the hands of the Crusaders for only about 100 years. But people were willing to go and fight due to failed crops, disease, all those things, plus a promise to get into heaven. And so um, during this time, there's a pope. His name is Innocent III. He ruled from 1198 to 1216, and under him, this idea, this notion of one flock under one shepherd, comes closest to fruition. So he was one of the most powerful and influential popes ever, and he was able to express church reform found in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. So here, at this Fourth Council, they decreed the doctrine of transubstantiation. They also instituted Episcopal Inquisition, uh, which was that every bishop should destroy any notion of heresy. They declared no new monastic orders or rules. Also, clergy should abstain from theater, hunting, etc. Uh, faithful, the faithful should confess their sins, and it was made unlawful to charge for sacraments. And so, again, Innocent III, one of the most powerful and influential popes ever, pushed through his agenda in the Fourth Lateran Council and made a lot of these things kind of canon law that uh, we know to be typical of the Catholic Church today. And so, around 1300, we see that a new pope is elected. And this pope decides that for Europe to have stability, the power should be centralized into the pope. And so to do this, Pope Boniface VIII created the notion of the papal indulgence, which opened the floodgates for papal power. So he thought, again, for Europe to have stability, all power should be centralized into the pope. And so he decides to do this notion of the papal indulgence. And so the indulgence, that forgiveness of sins can be merited, was based on God having given the church the authority to do so because God had given the church the keys to the kingdom. So since the church had the keys to the kingdom, then they could start this notion of the indulgence. So Pope Boniface declares that anyone in Europe that makes a pilgrimage to Rome will receive a full indulgence. So this creates authority for the Pope because if he can keep people out of hell, who cares about what the emperor wants, right? So again, a full indulgence if they make a pilgrimage to Rome, if they're loyal to the Pope. So this also creates a lot of money for Rome, and its population increases 8 to 10-fold during this time. So once again, Rome becomes a prominent political city. So some sees the Pope's rise of power and some support it. Some don't support it. King Philip IV of France um, decides to get involved in this because France and Rome are nearby. So the empire's focus shifts from France to Rome, and Philip doesn't like this. Philip calls Boniface a false pope on the basis that the theology of indulgences are wrong. And Boniface, in turn, excommunicates Philip, and Philip counters with, it doesn't matter because you're not a real pope. So we see a lot of kind of bantering back and forth, excommunication, well, you're not real to start with, those kind of things. So eventually Boniface dies, and Benedict the Ninth is elected as the new pope, and he wants to restore the relationship with France. So when Benedict dies, uh, Benedict, tries to put that in motion. He eventually dies, and Clement V becomes Pope. And Clement's way of reconstruction is to essentially become a vassal and submit to Philip. So whatever Philip wants, he'll do. So during this, Clement gains nearly unlimited power, and he decides to put his illegitimate children in places of power. So people begin to turn against the Pope because people aren't stupid; they know and they see. Clement is aware of this and tries to rally support in his hierarchy. So Philip pulls the heresy card, and a council is called. So when things begin to not go Clement's way, he goes and he apologizes to Philip. So in 1309, the Pope moves the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France. So this becomes known as the Great Western Schism and essentially puts the Pope under the authority of the French king. This is also known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. So during the schism, the papacy is corrupt through essentially having ecclesiastical taxes and building lavish palaces and appointing their children to places of power. And so the papacy was not a good and holy thing. It was very corrupt. Money and power certainly did corrupt that position, and anyone that position touched. Um, so the end of this Avignon papacy occurs when the College of Cardinals wants to pick someone who doesn't want to move the papacy, or who doesn't want to move the papacy back to Avignon. So they elect Urban VI, and he wants to reform and clean up the church, and he does this by appointing a lot of new cardinals. See, the old cardinals don't like the new cardinals. The old were called conciliarist, which they believed the power lies in the hands of all bishops, while the new were called papists, that is, they were loyal to the Pope. So the old elect a new Pope, Clement VII, and there are now two popes and two colleges. Both eventually die, but both colleges claim to be the true college, and both elect a new pope. So to end this dispute, the King of France suggests that both popes resign and the colleges come together to elect a new pope. And this is rejected because it makes too much sense, and conflict continues. So in 1409, both colleges call together a meeting in Pisa, um, again, to try and end this Great Western Schism. And so they agree to depose both popes and elect a new one. In 1409, they meet in Pisa, decide, you know what, we'll dispose of both popes and elect a new one. So two popes decide not to go away, and so now there are three popes, three people claiming to be the pope. The two that were disposed of didn't want to go away. They didn't want to give up their power. So one moves back to Avignon, and the other two stay in Rome. And so eventually, in 1414, the Council of Constance is called, and the two popes in Rome attend. And so the usurper pope resigns, so that the real pope does as well. So the usurper pope resigns here, as does the real pope, and then another new pope is elected. And then really, no one ever really looks at the Avignon Pope anymore. No one really considered himself a pope anymore except for himself. And so the end of this schism is in 1414 with the election of this new pope, and in the power of the and in the end, the power was leaning toward the conciliarists, and they were able to overthrow the pope and win the day for a while. Also at this council in 1415, John Huss is burned at the stake for not recanting, and we're going to talk about him here in a few moments. And all the leaders wanted him to do was to recant in order to affirm the power of the council. And so, I know I've just shared a lot of information with you, but there's just lots of different things going on and taking place during this time, between political development and theological development, and just all the various impact on one another. And so Real quickly, I want to talk about a couple of guys who are very influential. They were kind of the uh, forerunners of the reformers that we know and love, Martin Luther, etc. One of those is John Wycliffe. So Wycliffe was born in 1328 and lived until 1384. There's not many details about his early life. It's known that he was born in Yorkshire and he enrolled in Balliol College in Oxford. And for a short amount of time, he was the schoolmaster. So while at Oxford, Wycliffe greatly flourished and he began to teach large classes. So in philosophy, he was a very down to earth person. He was influenced by Platonic conception uh, through the writings of Augustine. And in 1374, Wycliffe was appointed to the rectory of Lutterworth, and later that year, he became a commissioner to the king. He most likely served as a theological advisor in this role. So in 1376, Wycliffe gave a lecture titled On Civil Lordship. And interestingly, his views on the church were feudal. And so he saw God as a great overlord, one who gives all positions, civil and spiritual. And people only maintained these positions if they continued in faithful service. He taught that if someone abuses their authority, then that person should resign from their tenure. And if a member of the clergy behaved in an evil manner, then that person would lose their claim to the office. On top of that, their earthly possessions could also be taken away by secular rulers because God has given the lordship of temporal things to them, just as God has given spiritual things to the church to oversee. So this teaching was very popular to some, including John of Gaunt, who was a noble, and thus it continued to spread. So commoners were increasingly displeased with the wealth and the lack of character found in the church clergy. Again, lots of scandal, abuse of power. They didn't even abide by their own rules. Different priests, bishops had their own illegitimate children and those kinds of things. So, but there were others who had advocated for an apostolic poverty. And so, obviously, the papacy and other church leaders did not like this kind of preaching, did not like this teaching, did not like what was coming from him. And so, in 1377 and 1378, Wycliffe was summoned and questioned by officials such as William of Courtenay, who was the Bishop of London, and Pope. I'm sorry, he was not the Bishop of London, but the Bishop of London was there, and Pope Gregory the 11th. However, due to the protection of Gaunt and a popular following with the masses, these examinations did not continue on very long. Again, Wycliffe was a very popular person among the masses. So shortly thereafter, Wycliffe began writing treatises that fought against the current church circumstances. And he argued that the scriptures set the regulations that the church has to follow. He went on to say that men, such as the Pope and cardinals, should not make rules for the church because only Christ is head of the church, and there is no way of knowing for sure that the Pope was a Christian. So he did think it was okay to have a Pope, but he needed to be one who strives for the simple conditions of early Christianity. Again, this kind of apostolic poverty, such as Peter. And so Wycliffe believed so strongly that the Bible was the law of God that between 1382 and 1384 he translated the Vulgate into English. It's not known how much Wycliffe himself translated, but it is generally agreed that he at least translated the New Testament. He also sent out poor priests whose purpose was to go and spread the gospel. He also rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation, and his view later became known as consubstantiation. And so, um, Wycliffe, very, very influential figure, very popular forerunner to um, the reformers. His ideas on civil lordship, that the secular government could take away from the church because God had given the secular government the ability to see over things temporal, um, and saying that church leaders need to be one who strives for simple conditions of early Christianity, those kinds of things. And so another major player is John Huss. He lived from 1372 to 1415, and he was a famous preacher and scholar, and he became rector of the University of Prague in 1402. And he defended Wycliffe's writings, but did not necessarily agree with him. Huss did not want to alter the doctrines of the church, just restore Christian life, just get people to start living Christianly again. The Archbishop of Prague got a papal decree to stop the teaching of Wycliffe, but Huss disagreed and came to the conclusion that one, an unworthy pope, that is one acting in personal interest, is not to be obeyed. The Bible is the final authority that every Christian will be judged by, including the Pope. He also believed that only God can forgive, and to sell that which only God can give is usurpation. And so he believed that the Pope was usurping what God can do. So only God can forgive, only God can give that kind of grace, and and to sell it via the indulgences was to usurp only what God can do. And then, secondly, he was also he was burned at the stake because he refused to recant his teachings. But no one could show him where he was wrong in the Bible, but and therefore he refused to recant, and thus he was burned at the stake. And so, um, in all of this, there are these monastic communities that are developing and thriving. And so monasteries is really where the Reformation stuff emerges from. It was here that there was a retrieval of the apostolic faith. And really that's two places where it was preserved, the monasteries and the universities. The monasteries were functioning like small churches function today. There's not a pressure to reform. It's not, they weren't mega churches. All eyes weren't on them. Money wasn't on them. They were just living in their communities, trying to live gospel-centered lives, and maintain uh, theological integrity and purity. Because it's hard to maintain those things when you're busy pursuing power. Um, and so uh, those monastic communities, again, is where this Reformation stuff will emerge as we talk about that in church history too. And so it's there is we have this retrieval of the apostolic faith, because again, and that happens again in the monasteries and the churches. I'm sorry, the universities, because in the churches people begin trying to get power and doing what they can to feed off the wealth of the church, rather than live gospel-centered lives, going about quietly, humbly proclaiming the gospel. And so that's going to wrap up our lecture today and our teaching on the Church History 1. I hope you found it to be enlightening. I hope you learned a lot. There's so much more that we could go in depth on, but nevertheless, time does not allow for that. If you have any questions, please email me. It's been a joy working with you. I've really enjoyed reading your journals and your life and practice report and those kinds of things. You have all been fantastic. And so, again, any questions, please let me know.